NWEA is proud of our alliance partnership that we have with KASA and the platform that it gives us to support Kentucky educators. And this is a good example of that. And we're excited about today. We have a team of NWEA support that work with you throughout the state. We have Molly Bowen, Tiffany Arce, Jessica Cunningham, Lindsay Skirtich, and my name is Michael Ward. We all work in partnership with the districts across the state to help you improve student learning. And our presenter today is Dr. Karen Lewis. It's a treat to have her in the state. She is the director for the Center of Student Progress, School and Student Progress at NWEA. She also co-leads our COVID research, which is going to be the focus of our discussion today, not only from that national perspective, but also looking specifically at Kentucky and Kentucky students. And so thank you for joining us today, Karen. We're excited to hear what you have to say and support Kentucky educators.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the warm welcome, everyone. I'm going to share some slides. Michael, will you confirm my slides are showing up like they should? Can you see that? Michael, will you give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides? Okay, great. Yeah, it's great to be with you all this morning. As Michael said, I am the director of one of the research teams here at NWEA. There's 3 separate teams. My team is our core mission is to work with, for, and in service of districts, and particularly around providing research that is actionable in nature. So over the last 2 years or so, I have been, as Michael pointed out, co-leading our national COVID research agenda and trying to make these findings as accessible as possible to really be supporting our partners as they're making sense of what's happening locally and figuring out how to cope and lead recovery efforts. So I want to talk to you today about findings from our most recent research brief, which came out in July of 2022. And I'm going to give you the national overview, lay of the land, and then we'll talk about what's happening in Kentucky specifically. I think all of you are familiar with NWEA, but I think it's worth mentioning that we are a mission-driven, not-for-profit organization that just happens to sell assessments. And for me, it is such a professional satisfaction to work for an organization such as ours that allows me to do work that really lives into that mission-driven nature of our work together. And as part of that, we really have a research agenda on my team and within the research department more broadly that really reflects the mission-driven nature of our work. And we pursue and tackle the kinds of big challenges in education that we know our people on the ground are facing, with the goal of really delivering those education stakeholders with actionable insights to help them do their work better. The MAP Growth Assessment is our flagship product, and it is data from this assessment that I'll be talking about today. For those of you that are less familiar, the MAP Growth Assessment is used nationwide, and in the K-12 space, we have about 11 million students test with us annually in public and private schools across the country, and that ends up representing about 1/4 of public schools. As you likely are well aware, the MAP Growth Test is an interim assessment. So it's designed to help educators know across the course of the school year how students are doing, what they're ready to learn next, so that they can be better supported. It's important to point out that the MAP Growth Test is a computer adaptive assessment that's grade level independent. So that means we're not tied to static questions at 3rd grade standards. We can capture student achievement well above or below grade level, which has become increasingly important over the last 2 years as we've seen COVID take its toll. Our research agenda in the COVID space has been an ongoing one that really launched as soon as the pandemic struck in March of 2020. And we released some projections about what we thought might happen in that early phase of the pandemic. And we made some projections based on what we know happens to students in the face of other school disruptions, and particularly what happens over the summer months when students are not in the classroom. And we expected initially to see declines in both math and reading achievement. We were able to revisit those projections with actual data in the fall of 2020 when students returned to the classroom, whether that was in person or remotely. And we saw that we've been slightly over pessimistic in our initial projections, and reading achievement was parallel in that first fall following the onset of the pandemic, meaning we weren't seeing any signs of impacts in reading, but we were starting to see the pandemic take its toll on math, and math achievement was already lower compared to pre-pandemic trends. At the end of the 2020-21 school year, we released another one of these kind of national status reports. Here we saw that bright spot in reading had faded away, and we were starting to see both the toll of the pandemic in reading and math. And concerningly, we were starting to see evidence that the impacts of the pandemic had been uneven, that particular student groups were hit worse than others. And those groups were students of color, particularly Hispanic, Black, and Indigenous students, and students in high poverty schools. At the start of the 21-22 school year, we released some data on what was happening in the fall of that year. And the bright spot there, if you want to call it a bright spot, was that at least we were seeing signs that we had potentially bottomed out. There was no longer an increasing in those gaps between current and previous achievement levels. So one way to spin that is that unfinished learning was at least no longer worsening. So our question then at the end of the 21-22 school year, if we had indeed bottomed out in the fall of that year, we wanted to know, are there any signs of rebounding? Are we starting to see any signs of improvement? And that's what we'll focus on today. Before we get to the data, I want to make it really clear what I mean when I say rebounding. To set the stage of how I use this term, I want to show you some fake data that represent national trends, but I think help make a clear picture of what rebounding could look like. So this graph is showing you what was happening in the 2020-21 school year. We have the COVID sample, which is the darker of the two shaded lines, and we can compare that to the pre-COVID sample. So what was happening for students across that school year relative to pre-pandemic trends. And what we saw, that darker shaded line, notice it is tilting upward. So we did see some growth for students during 2020-21. But importantly, notice that the steepness of that slope is not parallel with the pre-pandemic trends. So students were making gains, but they were lagging behind those pre-pandemic averages, which led to gaps that were already present in the fall, widening by the spring. So the question is, in 21-22, what could rebounding look like if we're seeing improvements over what was happening in that first year following the onset of the pandemic? I'm going to show you a couple scenarios. First, here would be the worst case scenario. So now I've dropped in some lines of what could be happening in 21-22. And notice here that we're really seeing something akin to what we saw in 2020-21, where growth in 21-22 is happening, but it still lags behind pre-pandemic trends. And this is the worst possible case scenario because this would suggest the pandemic is still actively harming students. And we actually have those gaps that were there at the end of 2020-21 are widening over the course of this most recent school year. This would not be signs of rebounding, right? This would be evidence that the pandemic is continuing to harm students. In contrast, the best case scenario would be if growth trends during 21-22 actually exceed pre-pandemic trends. So notice now that darker shaded bar is more steep than pre-pandemic trends, which leads to this shrinking of the gap. And I want to be clear, when I use the word gap, I'm specifically using that to take kind of the shorthand in the difference between the COVID and the pre-COVID sample. I know we're used to thinking of achievement gaps often in looking at differences between student groups, but in this case, I'm using it to compare differences between the COVID sample and the pre-COVID sample. There's also this more in-between scenario where growth in 21-22, look, in this case, those lines are parallel. So we see that growth in this most recent school year is consistent with pre-pandemic trends, which is better than 21-22, right, where it lagged historic averages. But even with parallel growth, if growth was looking more like average, this isn't the best case scenario because we know parallel lines don't cross, right? So if growth was consistent but not better than pre-pandemic averages, those gaps that are there would just persist and be maintained over time. So those are the three scenarios we could be looking for when we start to look at data in the 21-22 school year. I want to make it clear that the way I use rebounding, I do not use that interchangeably with the term recovery. When I talk about rebounding, I'm looking for evidence of improvements in achievement or growth trends relative to those downturns that we observed in 21-22. So this is in contrast with the term recovery, which would be this kind of end state that we're working towards. There's many ways you could think about what recovery could look like. And I think people often think about, well, we'll know recovery when kids have reached equivalence with where we would have expected them to be absent the pandemic. So recovery might look like returning to some kind of pre-pandemic status quo. That's problematic though, right? Because we know our education system still had its problems back in 2019 before we ever said the word COVID. And if we were to just simply return to the pre-pandemic status quo, that would be inherently accepting the disparities that were already inherent in our system back in 2019. So this would be the minimum we would accept as a possible definition of recovery. And then it's our hope that we can do even better than that and be learning some lessons over the course of the pandemic about how to support students that might help us eventually to gain traction on some of those really long-standing inequities in our system. But broad picture, know that when I talk about rebounding, I'm talking about evidence on the way to recovery. So let's talk about how and the kinds of data that we use to ask this question in our national sample. How would we look for evidence of rebounding? Well, to do this, we follow a 4-year panel of sample over all of the COVID impacted years. So this is one of the potential cohorts that we would study, and we would include them starting in the kindergarten year through the third grade year. And kindergarten would be back in 2018-19, extending through third grade in 21-22. And we want to compare these kids to pre-pandemic trends. So we're going to take another 4-year panel of test events that all occurred prior to the onset of the pandemic. So we'll be comparing, for instance, what's happening for third graders in 21-22, looking back to their peers in a pre-pandemic year, in that case, 18-19. And we do that consecutively for each grade within that 4-year panel. I want to point out that we include in the COVID sample the 3 years that have been impacted by the pandemic, starting in 2019-20, but we also include 2018-19. And this helps us establish some what we call baseline equivalence between the COVID and the pre-COVID sample. We want to feel confident that any difference we're seeing between these two groups is attributable to the pandemic. So we want to know that those groups were similar to as close as possible prior to the onset of the pandemic, and any divergence between their patterns is really due to the disruptions that have been wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic. We're not restricting our analysis to just this one cohort. We end up with a total of 6 cohorts in our analysis, so that by the final year in the 4-year panel, we're looking at students in grades 3 through 8. This ends up being about 8.3 million students included in our COVID sample from over 25,000 public schools, and a roughly equivalent size sample in the pre-COVID group of over 8 million students in 24,000 public schools. All right, so to help us understand what those growth trends look like, I'm going to show you some line graphs that capture trends over time. And I've included that little USA icon down there in the bottom, just so it's clear when I'm talking about national trends versus when I'm talking about Kentucky-specific data. So in these graphs, what we're going to be looking at are those following students over those 4 years in the panel that I've described. So we'll focus on just one of the cohorts for simplicity. And because we have the grade 2-5 cohort, that means we're looking at 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade in our panel. We'll be comparing outcomes for our COVID sample to a pre-COVID sample and using these darker shaded bars or lines to capture the COVID sample relative to lighter shaded lines that describe the pre-COVID sample. Recall we've got different years depending on which sample you're in. So for our COVID sample, we're looking at the 2018-19 school year following through the 21-22 school year and comparing that starting in the 2015-16 school year for the pre-COVID sample and ending in the 2018-19 year for that group. To be perfectly clear, right, we drop in this dotted line to make it very clear when the pandemic onset began, because we want to Kelly, I'm dropping in just very slightly different pieces of information here, so it might not be obvious how they're changing. Stick with me, I'll show you actual data here in a moment. The red dashed line represents the March of 2020, and then anything after that, that's where we're going to start to look for divergence between these two groups. So first, I'm just showing you what's happening in our baseline sample. So these are the trends that we see between 2nd and 5th grade for students in the pre-COVID sample. And notice here, this is consistent with what we know about how students change over the course of the year. We see these upward trajectories between fall and spring. The horizontal darker lines represent what's happening in the summer. So over the summer months, as you're well aware, I'm sure, we have a little bit of summer slide. So we see test scores between spring and fall drop ever so slightly and then resume that upward trajectory during the school year. Let's now drop in what's happening in the COVID. Michael, I saw your comments. Everybody at the slides progressing, we're doing well? Take that as a yes.
Mine weren't advancing. I had to click the forward arrow and then it asked me to sync with your slide deck, and it did, and now it is advancing. Okay. So maybe that will work for those that it's not advancing.
Okay. I'm on slide 26. Kelly, do you want to try that trick about that Michael just shared and see if that fixes it for you? Is anybody else experiencing the same problem? I am not that familiar with Teams, so I don't know what my options are here to try and fix this. I'm gonna, maybe I'll just try stop sharing altogether and then reshare, and maybe that'll help. I'm on slide 26. I'm gonna orient back to slide 26 where I left off. All right, Michael, can you confirm do you see slide 26?
I'm on 26.
Great. Kelly, how about you?
No, I'm still, it just comes right back up at the beginning at slide 1. And if I start clicking and then I do sync to presenter, it goes back to number 1.
Is
Anyone else having problems?
Oh, sorry, Kelly. I don't.
Yeah.
Can you maybe
Maybe
just call
should
out
I
the
maybe
slide number,
leave?
Karen, and then they could click to that one?
Okay. If Kelly, can you click to slide 26 and orient to that on your own, or
Yes,
does it
I
only let
can
you control
click
the
to slide
slides?
26, and that's what I've been trying to do. But obviously, some of what you're saying is not on the slide I'm at, so I'm staying confused about where you're at. Sorry.
That is frustrating. All right, well, I'm going to click now to
Sorry,
slide
Kelly.
27. All right, so on slide 27, what I'm showing here is now we're dropping in what's happening in the 2020-21 school year. This is the trend I've already described, where we're seeing growth for the COVID sample. Notice there is an upward tick to that darker shaded line, but notice also it's not consistent with the lighter shaded line. The slopes between those two groups diverge. And as a result, clicking now to slide 28, what we see is that there is a gap between the COVID and the pre-COVID sample. That's the number captured here, this 0.28. And this is telling us about the standardized difference between the COVID and the pre-COVID sample. And now standardized just means that we've stripped away that underlying RIT scale, which is rather arbitrary and hard to make sense of. When we put it in these standardized metrics, it makes it easier for us to compare across grades, across groups, and across other research studies. So a very fair question you might be asking yourself is, okay, looks like the difference is roughly a quarter of a standard deviation, a little bit larger than that. How bad is that? How do we make sense of what it means to have a quarter of a standard deviation gap between the COVID and the pre-COVID sample? Well, one way to put that into context is to compare it to what we've seen in the wake of other large-scale school disruptions. So if we look to research on what happened following Hurricane Katrina, we see there that math scores dropped about 0.17 standard deviations on average in New Orleans following the hurricane. So the COVID impacts that we're seeing are significantly larger than that. Another way to give this some context is to compare it to some benchmarks about the way we think about effect sizes for education interventions that are designed to improve test scores. So these benchmarks range from small to be skeptical, depending on the size. A thing to know about interventions that are targeted at improving education outcomes is it's really, really hard to change achievement. If you were to develop a new math tool tomorrow and you found that you were impacting kids' math outcomes by 0.1 standard deviations, that would leave you with a medium standardized effect, and you would be very happy. That's really challenging to get an effect that large. Our effect sizes that we're seeing due to the impacts of COVID place us squarely in that large effect size category. It's not impossible to produce test score increases that could match the size and scale of the problem we're seeing here, but it's really important to be realistic that that would be very hard to achieve, especially in a single year. It's not going to be impossible to ameliorate a size of this effect, but it's also not going to be a light lift, and it's not going to be a short endeavor. So I'm clicking on now to slide 29, just to reorient you what we saw in the 2020-21 school year. The main question is what's happening in 21-22. And we see that on slide 30, which I've now dropped in here, the line that's depicting what's happening for students in 21-22. And if you think back to those various scenarios that I set up at the beginning about what rebounding could look like, I think it's most clear that this is consistent with that in-between scenario. So the good news, and we don't want to lose sight of the good news here, is that the gains that we're seeing in 21-22, they're looking more consistent with pre-pandemic trends. So that darker shaded line is parallel with the pre-pandemic line. And that's really good news. We also see that the gap between COVID and pre-COVID achievement has dropped between spring of 21 and spring of 22 and is down 0.06 standard deviation units. That's not to say it's been ameliorated altogether. We still have a significant gap between current and prior achievement, but we do see some evidence that that's improving, given the shrinking in the size of that gap. This slide is showing you what's happening in math. I'm going now to slide 31, which is a parallel analysis, but showing us what's happening in reading. Consistently across our results, we've seen that math has been more impacted than what we're seeing in reading. And that's depicted here by the distance between the pre-COVID and the COVID group. It's not as dramatic as what we saw in the graph for math. We see similar trends in that in 2020-21, students were making reading gains that were less consistent with pre-pandemic averages. We have divergence between those two lines, but in 21-22, we see that reading gains have returned to be more consistent with pre-pandemic levels. And as a result, the gap that existed in spring of 21 has decreased by the spring of 22, and we're down by 0.03 standard deviation units. So moving on to slide 32, I showed you in those graphs just one of the 6 cohorts, and I want to summarize the trends we're seeing across all of those groups here. First, we could compare across subjects. We look between math and reading. Again, the good news is we see evidence of rebounding in both reading and math. However, we know that math has been more impacted. There's a further way to go to get kids caught back up in math. So there's less ground to be made up in reading, and we can expect to see kids returning to that place of full recovery sooner in reading compared to math. We also see here in slide 33, if we compare across age ranges, we've seen some key trends. We've consistently seen that younger students have been harder hit than older students. And the good news is, in this most recent year's worth of data, we see larger improvements for elementary students. We're seeing more evidence of those gaps shrinking for younger kids. This is in contrast to what's happening for middle schoolers who, yes, have been less hard hit in prior years, but we're seeing in this most recent year that more stagnation for this group. The size of those achievement declines stayed pretty consistent between spring of 21 and spring of 22. We can extrapolate what we've seen to give some estimates about how long it would take to return to that place of recovery or get kids back to where we would expect them to have been absent the pandemic if improvements continue at the same rate that we saw in 21-22. For elementary students, that timeline looks like a minimum of 3 years, far longer for middle school students where we're not really seeing improvements at all. These timelines are, I think, pretty alarming. 3 years is a long time, and it extends past when the federal recovery dollars will be available for schools to rely on to spend. It's also very alarming that this timeline for middle schoolers in many cases would extend past the time we could actually expect them to be in the classroom. On slide 34 now, it's also important to return to that point about how the impacts of the pandemic have been uneven. My biggest fear when we hit run on these analyses this summer before I started writing this brief was that we would only see evidence of improvements among more advantaged students. And I was so relieved to see that's not the case. We do see evidence of rebounding across school poverty levels and among most race and ethnicity groups. However, we know those are the groups that have been hardest hit. So even though we're starting to see some evidence of improvement, the gaps have widened over the last 2 years, and students in high poverty schools and students of color have a longer road to go in terms of regaining that ground because they have been hit harder. So that gives you the overlay of the land of what's happening at the national level. I want to talk now about what's happening in Kentucky specifically. I'm on slide 36 now. What I want to preface this by saying before I share these data is this is not a thorough research study of trends in Kentucky. We've taken the analyses that we did in the national report and have repeated them in the states for which we have adequate representation to feel good about those analyses, but I haven't gone state by state and had the capacity to be able to really dig into what's happening in that state. I see a hand raised.
Yes, I have a question, if you don't mind, to go back to slide 35.
Sure. Not this one.
I'm sorry,
This one?
34. You
34.
talk about with the elementary versus middle school, when you say larger improvements for elementary students, are those currently students in elementary school? I was trying to place that, like, are you talking about the current middle schoolers? I couldn't remember from your initial graph.
That's right. So if we're looking at students that are in elementary school in 21, 22, so that for us, we're counting students in 3rd through 6th grade by spring of 22, we're seeing larger improvements for those kids relative to students that were in 7th and 8th grade in spring of 22.
Thank you.
Of course. All right, so navigating back to slide 36 now. The other thing I want to put a little caveat around is around representativeness and generalizability. We test a fair amount of students in the K-8 classrooms in Kentucky, roughly 60%. But I want to be clear that we shouldn't necessarily expect that what we're seeing in that subsample of the overall state is necessarily going to generalize and describe all students in the state. We also look across a wide swath of years in this analysis between 2016 up until 2022. And so it's possible if within the state we have changes in the composition of schools that are testing with between those two samples, it could skew the results. And that would be more notable if we're looking at a state level as opposed to a national level. So I have to say those caveats as a researcher. They'll take away my research card if I don't, poo-poo my own results before I get to them. That said, I do think it's worth looking at these analyses and making sense of the trends that we're seeing in Kentucky. So now I'm going to show you graphs that depict what's happening in Kentucky specifically, and they're going to mirror those ones that we looked at in the overall national sample, and I'm on slide 37 here. So notice we see pretty similar trends to what we see on the national level, in that in the 2020-21 school year, we saw that divergence between the COVID and the pre-COVID sample. There's a fanning out of those two lines indicating students were growing in 2020-21, but not to the same extent we'd expect based on pre-pandemic trends. We also see this evidence in 21-22 of some rebounding, that the growth trends are now more consistent with pre-pandemic trends for students in Kentucky. Those lines have become more parallel to one another. But what I want to emphasize here is that we do see some evidence that the gaps have actually increased between spring of 21 and spring of 22. This isn't consistent across all the cohorts. We see in some cases those gaps have held steady, but there are several instances where they've actually increased. And that's true in this case when we're looking at the grade 2-5 cohort. And my read on this graph of looking at what might explain that is it looks like over the summer months, we actually had slightly steeper summer learning loss over the summer of 21 compared to pre-pandemic years. Now I'm on slide 39 showing what's happening in reading. Here too, we have both the consistency with national trends and that we saw divergence or slower growth in 2020-21, but we also have some bright spots here in that in 21-22, we're seeing growth trends that are being more consistent with pre-pandemic averages. On slide 40, I have just placed those graphs next to each other to capture some high-level trends that I see when I look across all of the cohorts. I think it's important to point out that we have this evidence of rebounding in 21-22. We're seeing that the growth trends are looking more consistent. But we also have some concerning evidence in that those gaps are either simply holding steady from what we saw in the spring of 21 or increasing slightly by the spring of 22, which bucks our national trends that at least in the elementary grades, we're seeing those gaps are shrinking, getting smaller by the spring of 22. I also want to point out that the achievement gaps that we're seeing here in Kentucky are larger than the national averages. So in math, for instance, the gaps that we're seeing are roughly 1/3 of a standard deviation relative to roughly 1/5 of a standard deviation at the national level. And we see similar discrepancies between Kentucky trends and national trends in reading. Now I'm on slide 41, and I want to show you one more way that we cut these data to help us make sense of what's happening currently. We're going to look more closely at what's happening in spring of 22 and compare that to pre-pandemic levels so that we can disaggregate across some of those key student groups to understand where unfinished learning, where achievement declines are the most marked. So on slide 42, I'm going to show you what we call arrow plots, and we'll start by looking in math. These arrow plots capture some key pieces of information, 3 key pieces of information, and I want to make sure that's really clear what I'm showing you here. So the base of the arrow, that circle at the base of the arrow, that's telling you where students were in 3rd grade for the pre-pandemic year. So this is showing you back in the spring of 2019, where were Kentucky 3rd graders achieving in terms of math. The tip of the arrow, that's now capturing the median achievement percentile ranking for 3rd graders in the spring of 22. So this is what's happening for our, you could think of it as our COVID sample. And then the number at the bottom, I'm on slide 45 now, tells us the difference between those two groups. So in the case of 3rd graders in Kentucky in math, we're seeing that that group has dropped by 11 percentile points between spring of 2019 and spring of 22. If we zoom out to look across all of the grades, we see evidence of those achievement declines in math for 3rd through 8th graders, ranging between 11 to 15 percentile points in the magnitude of those declines. On slide 47 now, I've placed what's happening in reading as well. And what we see here, we also see evidence of achievement declines across 3rd through 8th grade, but they're smaller in magnitude than the declines that we see in math. And that's consistent with what we've seen in our research at the national level as well. I placed this dashed line at the 50th percentile to indicate what the national pre-pandemic achievement average was. That's what's represented by the 50th percentile, the national average pre-pandemic. So I placed this here to note that you had some high achieving students, especially in reading, that were sitting well or fairly above those national averages prior to the pandemic. And even with some declines over the last 2 years, students are still sitting at, or in some cases, slightly above the national average for pre-pandemic achievement. In math, pre-pandemic achievement was slightly higher than those national averages in some cases, but the losses that we're seeing on order of 11 to 15 percentile points in magnitude have now pushed students below that national pre-pandemic average. For reference, when we compare the size of the declines that we're seeing in reading and math at the national level, the declines we're seeing in Kentucky are slightly larger than those national averages, which in the spring of 22 are between 5 to 10 percentile points, depending on grade in math, and 2 to 4 percentile points in reading. I'm on slide 48 now, and we're using that same arrow plot model, but now we're going to use that to help us disaggregate and understand how these trends differ for key student groups. And we're going to start by looking across race and ethnicity categories. So I've disaggregated for the student racial groups that we have adequate representation for. So I'm showing you now those arrow plots for Asian American, white, Hispanic, and Black students. What I want you to notice is that there's a pretty stark stair-step pattern in these data, that we have clear differences between these groups that were already evident in the data prior to the onset of the pandemic. Notice those circles, right? They were already different from each other. And if we drop in that 50th percentile to help us situate these achievement levels and declines relative to that pre-pandemic national average, it helps us see that we had differences where some student groups were well above national averages prior to the onset of the pandemic, and we already had disparities between those groups. If we compare the size of the decline, so the length of the arrow or the number at the bottom, we see that in some cases we have larger declines for Hispanic and Black students compared to their white and Asian American peers. There's that one rather alarming 21 percentile point decline for Asian American 5th graders. I think that's probably the smaller sample size in this case is leading to an inflated estimate here, and I don't think that's probably has a lot of basis to it. Ignoring that one, when I compare across groups, I'm seeing consistency with national trends that the larger impacts have been experienced by Hispanic and Black students. That's depicted here in this graph that's showing what's happening in math. And now on slide 49, I'm showing what's happening in reading. We see similar stair-step trends, but of a slightly smaller magnitude of declines in reading compared to math. So what these tell us is that we had disparities prior to the onset of the pandemic. Hispanic and Black students have been hit harder, so the pre-existing disparities have widened over the last 2 years. We also disaggregate, I'm on slide 50 now, by school poverty level. These are based on data that's available at the publicly available data about schools, about the percentage of students in a school that are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So we use that to categorize the schools in our sample. And here I'm comparing the schools that we would count as low poverty schools, where 25% or fewer of students in the school are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And we compare that to outcomes for students in high poverty schools, where 75% or more of students are eligible for free meals. What we see here is consistent with trends we've seen all along, that students that are more at risk, that experience more disadvantage, have been harder hit by the pandemic. And that's indicated by the size of the declines between 2019 and 22 is larger for students in high poverty schools. Here too, we see a case where there was already gaps between these groups, and those gaps have widened over the last 2 years, given students in high poverty schools have been harder hit. Slide 51 depicts this disaggregation in reading. Same trend where we have larger impacts for high poverty students in high poverty schools, which has widened the distance between these two groups. One thing I want to note here that bucks national trends in what we're seeing in Kentucky is that notice back in 2019, so where those circles are relative to the national average, students in high poverty schools in Kentucky were sitting pretty close to national averages, which is very different than the trends we see nationally, where if we look across the nation, students in high poverty schools were well below national averages even prior to the onset of the pandemic. So in slide 52 here, let's summarize what we see across the massive amount of data that I've just dumped on you. This is a very, I think, mixed bag of findings, and I want to make sure we don't just perseverate on what the bad news is, but make sure we're also leaning into what I think is cause for hope. And that is, we see that in 21-22, even in the midst of an extremely challenging year, it's not as if we had that strong return to normal we were all hoping for at the beginning of the 21-22 school year. Still a really hard year. But despite that, we do see evidence of rebounding, and growth trends in that year are more consistent with pre-pandemic trends, especially compared to what we saw in 2020-21. What gives us cause for concern, though, despite those upward trajectories looking a little bit better, is that achievement gaps in Kentucky are either holding steady from where they were in spring of 21 or increasing slightly. And we know, based on which student groups have been harder hit and what improvement patterns are looking like, that we can expect recovery is going to be a lot slower for students in high poverty schools and students of color who have been disproportionately impacted. What I think these data really point to, and what is an important message to take away from this talk, is that it's very critical that we're thinking about recovery both in terms of a long-term effort, but also being really clear that it's the moment that we need to think about right-sizing recovery efforts to be proportional to student need. The worst case scenario would be to apply a kind of one-size-fits-all Band-Aid approach to helping kids recover without taking into account that some student groups have been harder hit than others. It's not just a matter of asking the question, are we doing the right things to get kids recovery? It's, are we doing enough of the right things? We know that interventions might meet the needs of kids that have not experienced large impacts of the pandemic, but would be inadequate to catch up the kids that have been harder hit. So it is really critical in this moment that we're thinking about making sure we're meeting students where they're at and providing supports, resources, interventions in proportion to those needs. It's very possible you want to know more after what you've learned today, and I want to point you to a resource that we have put together, a dashboard that collects data at the Kentucky level to help you understand other metrics besides what I've included in this talk today. And you can navigate to that dashboard from this QR code or the website. To give you a sample of what those dashboards look like, here I've taken a screenshot of just some of the data that are available. In those dashboards, you can play with other term comparisons. So for instance, here I'm comparing what's happening in fall of 21 to spring of 22 to understand within 1 year, how are things varying. In addition to looking at things like median achievement percentiles, you can also look at projections of what percentage of students were likely to meet proficiency on end of year math assessments. So here we're seeing this picture where we are seeing some signs of improvement, right? Those spring percentiles in some grades look slightly higher than fall percentiles. And we're seeing some increases between fall and spring in the percentage of students that are estimated to be on track for proficiency. So this is just one screenshot of what those dashboards include, and I encourage you to navigate there and play around if you want to look at other combinations and ask other questions of the data. With that, I want to thank everyone for being here today. I'm going to stop sharing my slides so I can take your questions without having all the screen clutter, but I'm happy to go back to any figures that might be useful if you want to look a little bit closer.
We're trying to catch up with you, Karen. You speak really fast for us Southerners.
I'm from Missouri, so I don't, sometimes Missouri gets counted as a southern state, sometimes it gets bumped in Midwesterner, so maybe I talk more like a Midwesterner. I'm gonna drop my email into the chat in case anyone has any questions after today, while you're percolating on these results. I'm happy to keep the conversation going.
Great. Anybody like to ask a question while we're all on?
This is Jana Beth Francis from Davis County. Karen, thank you very much. The terms rebounding and recovery, how you all are using them really makes sense to me. Is that just what you all discussed at NWEA, or have you been reading other works that's using those words?
You know, Jada, I stole it from the way economists talk about financial recovery in the marketplace, but I haven't seen other education researchers use the terms similarly. But it was important to me to be really careful in the language that made sure that recovery is a long road. So we need something to capture that there are steps along the way to get us there. And rebounding was one way that helped me to think about and distinguish between those two things.
Thank you. And I guess my last question would be, is there anything you think we should look at when we look at our individual schools and student data that might be useful at the district level? You kind of showed us the national, the state. Any suggestions for what we might do at the district level?
I think it is really clear to be using local data at the school level to understand the impacts within a school. We have consistently seen that there's going to be variability within a district, depending on all the factors about the concentration of poverty within a school and the demographic makeup within schools. And so I think having a real clear idea of which students, which schools in particular have been harder hit will help target resources and make sure that those resources are going to the schools that have students with greater need.
Thank you.
This is Tammy from KASA. Thank you guys for being on here today and presenting this information. I was a little late logging in, but I have a question. I know districts are looking at their state assessment data. They're analyzing that. What or how long will there be comparisons that they might be able to rely on from NWEA with the state assessment results for Kentucky?
You mean how long will we continue our COVID research agenda on our assessment, then also be looking national versus states shots?
And how they might correlate with the state assessment data.
So the correlation between the state assessment data is based on the linking studies that we publish for states where we have adequate representation. And so those linking studies help make cutoffs based on macro scores about what percentage of students we expect to be on track, but we don't actually have access to those data. So those projections are all part of the dashboard, part of reports schools read, but have not been part of our national research agenda. We are actively thinking about what our exit strategy is here. I would love nothing more than to, be out of a job. It has been really taxing over the last 2 years to continue to bring these really hard news to schools and districts and the nation level about how hard COVID has impacted students. But I don't think I'm going to be out of a job anytime soon, seeing what a timeline looks like for recovery. So we're committed to doing these kind of end of year status reports at the national level for at least the next year or two. And we have, for the states, when we have adequate representation, are doing a presentation like I've done for you today, where we look at a state level, how do those state results compare to the national? So I think you can expect that in the spring of 23 and the spring of 24 as well.
It seems, I guess, hopeful in terms of the reading data that the period for recovery that gap might close sooner than mathematics. And this might be an unfair question, But what advice would you give to schools or school district leaders as they're looking at specifically their schools, and you've already mentioned looking at the diverse populations and how they might be affected and allocating resources based upon that. But are there any final recommendations you might give based upon all of the research you've been doing?
That's a great question. And we have a partnership that's focused on trying to understand which recovery interventions schools are using and which are most impactful. So those data are still very much being collected, but some early signs from that project helped me kind of coalesce on some recommendations. And the first is that I'm seeing a real urgency gap between the way we're responding to this crisis and particularly the way in which parents understand the scale of the crisis. We know a lot of recovery interventions that were offered to students were opt-in, right? So students could choose whether or not they wanted to take part of like a summer learning opportunity. And I completely have so much empathy for parents that know their students have really suffered over the last 2 years and want them to have the chance to have a summer and for kids to be kids. But it is going to take concerted effort to get those kids caught back up, get them on track. And I think we need stronger partnerships between schools and families so that we have that active engagement on the part of parents to make sure their kids are enrolling for and taking advantage of these opportunities. So I think to the extent that schools can be vocal about the impacts of the pandemic that they're seeing, and I know that takes some vulnerability. Schools don't want to admit our kids are doing worse now than they were prior to the pandemic. But I think parents need to have a better understanding of the scale of the problem so that they can engage in that process.
Thank you. That's some very good advice, especially when you look at that summer slide. That's always traditionally there, but then you could almost split that as a positive to show the effects that summer learning, that intentional focus by schools with students during the summer, what effect that can have. And when that didn't happen, here's the result. So they might be able to flip that positively.
I agree. And that is actually the focus of our next national research brief we'll release in December. Is going to be focusing in specifically on summer learning loss. And very initial, keeping this in the circle of trust, very initial findings suggest that we do see some evidence that summer learning loss at the national level has been dampened slightly over the last 2 years relative to pre-COVID trends, which suggests schools are trying to take advantage of those summer months to support kids. But the scale at which we're implementing those programs does not meet the scale of the crisis. So for instance, and we work with a partner and they had all of maybe 30 kids enroll in their summer programs. And the lift it takes to get those programs off the ground, let's make sure we're pulling in more kids and taking advantage of those additional learning opportunities to really meet students' needs in this moment. Well, I do want to emphasize, I'm happy to take any follow-up questions. Please make use of my email. I'm really thankful for your time and attention this morning, and I hope what we brought here is helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lewis. Very insightful and helpful. And thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us and learn with us today and let us know how we can support you. And we'll be following up with the recording as well as professional learning credit, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have after we get off of the call today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you all. Have a good day.